Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Seneca Social Studies. Another reform movement that we're going to talk about here is the women's rights reform movement. So what you have to remember in the early 19th century is women had many duties at home and in the community. However, they had very little legal or political rights. Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, the second president, she would tell her husband to remember the ladies when he was going to the Constitutional Convention. And for many years, women's cries for equality went mostly unheard. So many women of the early 1800s started to be influenced by the abolition movement in the North. They became actively engaged in fighting for the rights of African Americans, and it really left their wants and needs on the back burner. So many of the women who were fighting to abolish slavery and who struggled to gain the rights for themselves, they began to fight for their own rights. And they very quickly found that they needed to defend their right to speak in public and make their voices heard. So women really made strides, spearheading a lot of reform movements, if you remember what we talked about. Dorothea Dix and the prison reform movement, the temperance movement against alcohol, and now the abolition movement against slavery. Unfortunately, many of the critics did not want women to leave their traditional female roles as a homemaker. That actually includes men and women. So there were a number of well-known women reformers in the early 19th century. Two very popular ones are the Grimme sisters. These are Angelina and Sarah Grimme. They came from a slave-holding family from South Carolina, and their fight to participate in the freeing and educating of slaves really eventually led to their involvement in the fight for women's rights. Angelina, she contested traditional norms because she refused to obey her husband during their wedding ceremony, and Angelina published a pamphlet named An Appeal to the Christian Woman of the South, and Sarah published one named the Epistle of the Clergy of the Southern States, in which both of these pamphlets really argued against slavery. And another well-known women's rights activist was, of course, Joyner Truth. In 1797, she was born Isabella Baumfree. She was a slave in New York. In 1826, a year before they actually abolished slavery in New York, she escaped her slave owner and went to an abolitionist family, and she began to work for the church. She declared that the Spirit called on her to be a traveler or sojourner and preach the truth. So she named herself Sojourner Truth. Even though she never really learned to read or write, she had really no education, she impressed so many people in the United States with her speeches advocating for the abolition of slaves and fighting for women's rights. So we had other women reformers as well. We had transcendentalist Margaret Fuller. She wrote The Women in the 19th Century. We also had Lucy Stone. She was a gifted speaker who was well known for her abolitionist speeches for the Anti-Slavery Society, and she really fought for women's rights. You also had right there Susan B. Anthony. She turned the fights for women's rights into a political movement. She argued for things like equal pay for equal work. She argued for women's suffrage, or the right for women to vote. And you had Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who founded the National Women's Suffrage Association. She wrote many documents, and you'll see that she also created or co-founded the Seneca Falls Convention. So you have a lot of women fighting for women's rights. Makes sense. But you also had a lot of opposition to women's rights. So even though women were really leading the fight for their rights, you also had men who would fight. However, women's concerns really became a national issue when women took more of an active and leading role in their reform for women and abolition. So it didn't always travel the easy path. As a matter of fact, it hardly ever did. There was definitely a lot of opposition for these women who were advocating for their rights, and it was men and women. You see right there on a sign at the bottom, headquarters opposed to women's suffrage. Men did not want women to be able to vote. Men would oppose women's rights, saying that women they lacked the physical or mental strength to survive without a men's protection. And like I said, even some women were opposed to the women's reform movement, arguing that they didn't need any more rights. They were happy being a homemaker or taking care of the children at home or taking care of things in the community. So there was definitely an opposition, and I think it's because of this opposition where we could say that really the women's rights movement, while it did gain some speed or some steam, it really didn't take off as it should, especially when you start talking about the Equal Rights Amendment and its non-ratification of a lot of states making the Equal Rights Amendment later on where it was not approved. So I mentioned before we had the Seneca Falls Convention and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So the Seneca Falls Convention, women believed that they needed a meeting place or they needed a convention to be able to really fight for their rights or show their unity in their fight for their rights. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, I believe I said that right. She was an educated Bostonian, and she advocated for reform, and she was really the bridge between the feminist and the abolitionist movements. They brainstormed this idea to have one area, invite all these other reformers, have them attend, have them give speeches, and figure out the best way to attack women's rights. So on July 19th, 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York, the Seneca Falls Convention convened. So the Seneca Falls Convention really launched the first organized women's rights movement in the United States. And it was really the first public meeting about women's rights that was held in the United States. It was attended by some 240 people, including people like Frederick Douglass and many other reformers who worked in the temperance and abolition movement. Susan B. Anthony, like we said, she fought for women's suffrage, the right to vote, equal pay and equal work, and women and men alike argued for things like women's equality, improving laws regarding child custody, laws regarding divorce, and improving laws about property rights. But this is not the only thing that they did. You can see right here they have this women's rights convention, the people who went to this convention. And out of this convention, write something called the Declaration of Sentiments, or the Declaration of Rights. So really the founding fathers of our nations, right, to escape the British tyranny and the British crown, they demanded their freedom. And Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, where he claimed that all men were created equal. Now we know that didn't include women, Native Americans, or African Americans. So all men was not really all men. In 1837, Sarah Grimme wrote that men and women are created equal, and whatever is right for men to do is right for women. So this is really the stuff they put into the Declaration of Sentiments. These organizers of the convention wrote this document, and they used the Declaration of Independence as the basis for its language. However, the authors of this document included 18 charges against men as mankind. And the declaration was signed by over 100 of the 240 attendees. So women's rights really gained this momentum during the 19th century, but it didn't last long, however, because you have to remember, this is the antebellum, this is the urbanization, 1840 to 1860. And what really happens in 1840 to 1860, the ugly stain of slavery takes over, and we start having the Kansas-Nebraska, we have bloody Kansas, we have the United States really just kind of plunging into the Civil War, where slavery and anti-slavery and war takes the forefront, and then women's rights go straight to the back burner again, where they would really continue for generations and generations and generations to struggle for their rights.